Hello, I'm Gina Fitt, and you've either surfed to or purposely selected Life Talk with Bern Moses. Welcome to our show today. We have some very important material to cover, and I'm anxious to get started. Bern, last week we were talking about setting goals, and you mentioned your dislike for that word, and we had a very interesting conversation about having pursuits, and you mentioned in that process about being on purpose, and that intrigued me, and I was wondering if you could explain a little bit to me about being on purpose and what that means to you.
Okay, a couple of issues, if I may. Make it clear to everyone that I don't dislike goals, I dislike the word and the semantical impact that it can have on us. And we talked in terms of using as an alternative the word pursuits. It more clearly defined what was really happening. And yes, the idea of purpose did come up. And if we're going to discuss this today, people need to take a moment and dash away and get a notepad because they want to do some graphs and notes on this one.
I know I'm ready.
Yeah, this is pretty important. Yeah, if we're going to talk about purpose, it's rather fascinating. Some years ago, I remember reading that Napoleon Hill, who wrote the great book Think and Grow Rich, which is a trick if you can pull it off. But at any rate, Napoleon Hill wrote this wonderful book that has had a positive impact on a lot of people's lives. Napoleon Hill was a wealthy man. He had made some good investments. He was very successful, I understand, in the insurance industry and as an author. And in his latter years, he commissioned some young scholars to investigate the top 200 personalities in human history to find what common denominators there were, feeling that if we could find what those denominators were and teach ourselves and each other what to do, then everybody would be more successful. And that's logical on the surface, you know.
Right.
There were a lot of constants, there's no question, but there was one prevailing issue that all of these people had either chiseled in granite, scratched on papyrus, written a book, broadcast over the airwaves, and that was they all had a sense of purpose. And I found that fascinating, and so you begin to examine purpose. What is that? Typically, I'm going to start over here, and I perceive purpose as being somewhat of an equilateral triangle, if we're going to graph this thing out. And a purpose is not a goal, it's not a mission, it's not a project or a plan, it's something that we're on. A clearly defined purpose would not be something you could ever accomplish. In other words, it would be who you are, what you do, the course that you're on, in other words, like being on purpose.
It's a direction that you're taking?
Yes,
I see.
And so, to be properly defined, it would be abstract. It would be very brief, and it would have three essential ingredients within it. First of all, it would be based on love. In other words, a clearly defined purpose would have a love as its base, a concern for other people, a need to contribute, to elevate, to enhance, to enrich, to enlighten, that we've talked about in the past.
Yes.
This line over here would represent preparation.
Well, that's interesting.
See, in other words, the will to win doesn't mean a thing. You know, we hear a lot about the will to win, and frankly, I don't think it means very much. Because I've seen a lot of people with the will to win, but if they weren't prepared to do so, they probably wouldn't. Preparation, what that really means is that period of our lives when we take time out to acquire, to assimilate, to absorb, to accumulate knowledge and wisdom and power. For example, you remember back when we talked about strategizing.
Yes.
The acquisition of knowledge, which is of the mind, skill, which is of the body, and power, which is represented by money or authority or celebrity. Okay, there has to be a period of our life where we prepare ourselves to what? To contribute.
I see.
Okay.
Well, we've heard these words before.
Yes, and they're going to keep coming up over and over again. It's based on love, the willingness to prepare, with the need, the intent, the commitment to contribute. Okay, that would be a purpose. Now, what's really fascinating, Gina, it's pretty evident when you go out into research human behavior, as I have over the years, that if a person does not have a purpose for their life, since they don't live in a vacuum, they will have a posture about life. Now let me say this again. If you don't have a purpose for your life, we tend to have a posture about life. It doesn't sound quite as good, does it? A posture would be drawn this way.
If I may, Bern, could you give me an example of a purpose? Someone you may know who had a purpose, or someone who our listeners may have.
Oh, when
may
we
be
talk
familiar with.
when we talk about the major characters in our history, for example, the gentle Galilean carpenter had a purpose. You know what I mean? In other words, and I think most of those who have studied it are clear about that. Winston Churchill had a purpose. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a purpose. John Kennedy had a purpose. In other words, it was an intention for their existence, how they applied themselves. And if you're on purpose, you can be on purpose on a park bench or sitting in a cathedral. It doesn't make any difference. But you see, the opposite of that is posture. A posture would be based on fear. See, people posture about life an awful lot. There are people who I'm sure who are eavesdropping on us today who have kind of determined that life is tough, life doesn't work. You got to take care of number one, and if you don't, no one else is going to. Dog eat dog. That would be a posture. It's not based on love. It's based on fear. See what I'm saying? Usually accompanied by neglect. In other words, the person who's not reading, the person who's not thinking, who's not wondering and groping and examining and testing and experimenting with life is probably neglecting out of some subconscious tendency to survive. And there's nothing wrong with surviving. Don't misunderstand me, but it's just not as good as thriving.
Now you're saying they're neglecting these areas in order to survive? Or
Pardon?
they're neglecting areas of growth in order to survive?
Yeah, in other words, they're caught in their survival, and so they're neglecting to grow.
I see.
You've heard circumstances where people are so busy making a living, they haven't learned how to live.
Yes.
You know what I mean? In other words,
yes.
because if out of neglect, based on fear, we tend to adapt, okay, and then after a while we recognize, whoa, things aren't working too well, and so we strive to survive. Okay, and those, rather than contributing, we're surviving, taking care of ourselves. See what I'm saying?
I see.
And the thing it is, these two things exist on what I call the time lifeline, which I have mentioned in the past. As a time lifeline is that line that extends along here that represents, I'll review, the time and the energy that each and every one of us has at our disposal. Time and energy essentially is life, okay? And it's the life that we have between this moment now, right now,
right,
and the questionable place in the future when we cease to exist, okay? So here we are moving along, and we're either functioning out of purpose or out of posture. Now, which do you suppose, by looking at that, would take the most time and the most energy?
Well, you know, my first thought before you had drawn the time lifeline was I noticed that you have a triangle here with a very solid wide base, and you have a triangle here that's maybe precariously balancing on a very fine point, and I imagine
would think so, yeah.
that would be a difficult state to be in. You'd constantly be tipping over, very
challenging.
Unstable, huh?
Challenging, no question. Yeah, the thing of it is, both of these take about the same amount of time and energy. That's the tragedy of it. And so if it's a matter of understanding to make this choice, if it's possible, and in order to do that, you have to be clear on what the purpose is. This is not easy, by the way. In seminar, for example, and when I'm doing essays, I'll get into the subject of purpose, and I've had people just escape. I mean, they go to sleep on me. They don't want to hear it. And you start getting into purpose, and it's so challenging. As a matter of fact, my background tells me that when people attempt to write a purpose, chances are it's much too complex. What they're really doing is writing a mission statement. There's objectives and, quote, goals, or certainly pursuits in mind when they write the purpose statement. And the mission statement is something entirely different. I'm saying that a purpose statement is very clear, very crisp, very concise. For example, I've written one, and it's taken me years to conclude it. No, to get down to it, if I can find it here.
Oh, I'd love to hear your mission statement, your purpose.
If we can. Once I had this on paper, I recognized it's where I had been since I was a very, very young man. But to define it, to discern it, to confine it to one sentence was very challenging. I started, like everybody, with a great big one, you know what I mean, and gradually chopped it away and examining the words and the semantics and and this is what essentially I've come down to, that my purpose has been, is, and will be to wonder, to examine, experience, and enjoy my existence in order to better understand how I might enrich and enliven those around me, thereby warranting my being and having been. And that's it. Now, let me review this. There's a lot in here.
I was thinking that's a mouthful.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
a meaty sentence.
And a heart full and a life full. And
Yes.
what have you. My purpose, to wonder. My experience is that just to wonder about things will turn the heads of more angels than a plea will. Just to wonder. To wonder is to acknowledge your ignorance, which I think should be celebrated every day. In other words, I don't think a day goes by when I don't go, wow, am I ignorant? And what that does, it opens the mind to ideas, and it inspires you to read and to think and to listen carefully and to research, like I say. I can remember I'll give you one illustration, for example, to wonder. When I was a young boy on that New Hampshire farm that we've mentioned in the past, we lived on a farm where electricity played around that farm all summer. It was really uniquely placed on this knoll, and it was kind of frightening at times. But I remember one night after we'd been working out in the yard and laying some fence posts in,
Yes.
I was sitting in the kitchen playing parcheesi with my daddy. And I was kind of nervous. The lightning and the thunder was crackling around us and whatever. And I said, Daddy, what would happen if the lightning hit that fence post out there that we put in today? Mm-hmm. And he said, oh, I don't know. He says, it might splinter it or shatter it, or it might catch on fire, any number of things, I suppose. And it's though someone heard me. At that moment, I swear, there was a I see it happening, and that post disappeared. We had trouble finding splinters the next day.
Really?
Oh, it was incredible. But just to wonder, and you saw, I was always grateful, of course, that I hadn't said, Daddy, what would happen
if lightning
hit me? But that's another issue. But to wonder, to examine, to not take anything for granted. You know, in our country, we tend to think if something is working, don't mess with it. Don't try to fix it. Mm-hmm. And to examine means that if something is working, maybe there's a way it'll work better.
Well, this makes me think, so often in our lives, especially going to school, we're expected to come up with the answer or to have the information, and if we don't, there's something wrong with us.
Yeah.
We're not making the grade, we're not passing the test, we're not as intelligent as everyone else. But I can see your point. It seems like the more we question, we're creating an environment where information is good.
Yes.
To receive more information is
It's
good.
kind of like they want the answer oftentimes, and so what happens to us when we find an answer, we stop thinking.
Yes.
Where oftentimes if you keep going, there's another answer, and then perhaps another, and another. It's kind of like working in a computer. I mean, I don't think we'll ever reach into the depths, or at least I won't, into the depths of Microsoft Word and PageMaker. You know what I mean? There's always something else that you can do, and it's kind of fascinating. And I think life is the same way, that if you keep watching and wondering and examining, you're going to come up with things. But when you do that, you see things that perhaps would be easily overlooked, I'll tell you. It's fascinating. But to wonder, to examine, experience. You got to experience. Life is experiences. The more experiences you have, more life you enjoy. But to experience and enjoy. Enjoy means more than a happy acceptance of what's happening, but to enjoy. It's like enjoying an income because you contributed, you paid the price, and now you enjoy the result. But to wonder, to examine, experience, and enjoy my existence, in order to better understand. Not saying to understand, not to absolutely know, but to better understand how I might, doesn't mean I can or will, but how I might enrich and enliven those around me. Now, why would I care about that? It's obvious that if I can surround myself with successful, happy people, my life will be successful and happier. I mean, I don't know why we haven't just gotten into that act a long time ago as a society. But to better understand how I might enrich and enliven those around me. Now, enrich means more than just financially, but spiritually and emotionally and in every way.
Intellectually.
And enliven. In other words, to help them be who they are, to come alive, those around me, thereby warranting my being. That satisfies my libido, the being. and my having been satisfies posterity. In other words, and that's a statement of purpose. Now, I can be on purpose. I mean, I have had experiences in my life where I was making tens of thousands of dollars a month, and just in a few days I was broke, and yet I was on purpose. And so there's a sort of peace that goes with that, that's kind of understanding, that goes beyond understanding. You had something.
Well, I was just thinking, you had mentioned originally when you were talking about purpose and introducing it, that it's something that you can never accomplish completely.
Right.
And certainly your statement here of your purpose falls into into that category. It's something that's a continuing process for you.
Here's something too that our viewers and listeners might think about. Sit down with your loved one, your spouse, your sweetheart, your significant other, and say, what is the purpose of our relationship? A lot of people have never addressed that.
Yes.
What's the purpose of our relationship?
Yes.
And start thinking about that and defining that, and it gives you something to hold on to during the challenging and difficult times. Because I'll tell you, when you're on purpose, you can be flat broke, in debt, and still feel pretty good about yourself.
I think it would be interesting to see how many of us have the same purpose in that
yeah.
relationship.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah,
I think
until
we'd
you
find out
define
a
it.
lot about ourselves, wouldn't we, and our partner.
It's kind of like, if you would right now, I saw Stephen Covey. We have to give him credit for this. I've seen him do this in the past. Close your eyes for a moment, if you would.
Okay.
Okay, close your eyes. Point north. Where do you think north is? And I'm going to do the same thing. Let's see, we came in here. I'm going to say that way. Okay, open our eyes. My gosh, I wonder if we're right. Hey, we're pretty simpatico here. Gee, how old are you? No. No. Easy boy. No. Now, purpose is terribly important. All I'm saying is sit down, start writing, thinking about it, come up with a statement of purpose, and that's the beginning of progress.
I had one other thought, and I don't know if this is of relevance here or not, but as you were reading your purpose to me, it seemed to me that to wonder, to examine, and to experience and enjoy your existence seems like what little children do automatically. And I'm wondering if there's a sense of purpose that's maybe even built into us as human beings that we need to think about.
You know, I think we have a psychoscope within us. There seems to be some evidence of that. Some years ago, over several years, we did what I call a socioeconomic review and a job relationship analysis. And we asked tens of thousands of people, well, 20+ thousand people, several questions, one of which that if you became financially independent, when you got back from your vacation, would you return to the work you're doing? 87.5% said no. In fact, some of them were much more, vehement than that about it.
Emphatic.
Okay? Yeah. We said, well, let's imagine for a moment then that if you were financially independent, that money was not an issue, nor was education, nor was time or age or family or any other restrictions you might have in your life. If you could do anything you wanted to do, what would it be? Gina, some people cried. Some people cried. They had given up that dream a long, long time ago. Some people were vague and they didn't want to address it, but we sat there patiently, and I'll tell you, and we might as well say, in 100% of the cases, every single person we talk to, when given a choice, wants to make a difference. Perhaps just in their family, or they want to make a difference in their community, their job, their business, or in the state, or in the community, or the country, or the world. They want to make we have an innate need to contribute. We have an innate need to make a difference. A lot of times we can't find out where to do that, and that's tragic oftentimes. You see, the reason we want to get on purpose is there's something magical that happens when you've defined this carefully. That once you have a purpose, you have established automatically parameters for your life. In fact, we could call them, we say parameters, or we could say the principles for your life. And they're yours, not something that's been thrust upon you by an ideology or some other thing, but they're your parameters. And there is an innate sense of what is appropriate and inappropriate about the conduct of your life, and you will know, if your purpose is properly defined, that when you play, outside those parameters, that the parameters will come out and encompass that behavior. And if you play again, they will get broader. For example, this is our purpose, and these are your parameters, and if you violate those principles, You know, it kind of comes out this way and this way and this way, and pretty soon your life falls flat and you don't even know why. And so the purpose establishes parameters. Now, once you have your parameters and principles established, now is the time to define clearly what you're going after in your life, what your pursuits are, okay? And your pursuits should be categorized, and we can discuss that probably next week. They should be categorized into social and emotional, spiritual emotional, social secular, physical tangible, and vocational avocational pursuits. But if you were clear and isolated those different issues, they would appear up in the apex of your triangle, right? And so you have your pursuits. Now we'll expand on this more as we go along.
Okay.
After pursuits are clearly defined, then you begin to develop your plans for capturing them, all right? And plans would emanate out from that pursuit, and from this one, and from this one, and from this one, in such a way that there's harmony. You're in concert. I mean, this is incredible. In other words, your plans, in other words, for example, when they're overlapping like that, I'll tell you what I think of sometimes. Whenever I get to this point, this comes into my mind. So often I've heard of people saying that we should put God first, our family second, okay, and our jobs third. You ever heard anything like that before?
I've heard that, yes.
And I've seen people go, oh, yeah, they're really touched by that. Well, I look at that and I wonder, and I examine it, and I say, wait a minute. Someone would object to that. I mean, that's not comfortable altogether. Some people say, well, yeah, the boss would be kind of unhappy if you weren't willing to work on Sunday. And the family, you know, I mean, it gets kind of confusing. But the fact of the matter is, if these things are properly related, it would be this way. I would think that if you're going to look to a God, he'd like to be in all of it. And family should be considered in all of it. And job should be considered. In other words, there would be this synergy. And that's what happens when you're on purpose.
Well, it looks to me like you're weaving everything together,
exactly.
The threads of your life, if you want to use an analogy.
Now, plans are long-term, 1 year, 2 years, 5. The Oriental psyche has plans 200 years into the future. I mean, pro formas. We tend not to do that. The American mind and psyche tends to go maybe 3 months to a year, maybe 5.
Maybe till Friday.
Yeah, exactly.
What are your plans this weekend? Well, I don't know yet.
See, but once you have your plans that are in concert with your parameters and your purpose, then you begin to break that down into small projects. And again, if they stay within those parameters, they're going to be in concert. There's harmony in your life. And you see how that would be? Little short ones.
Yes.
A project is maybe a day, a week, or a month long. They'd have to certainly be in harmony with your plans. Then we have to understand the essential factor of practice. As we start practicing. I know Nike says just do it. And I'm saying, wait a minute, I'm not ready for my Super Bowl. I'm still practicing. We're practicing today. We're practicing communicating. We're practicing videotaping. We're practicing living, as far as I'm concerned. Practice should be an essential part of our daily vocabulary because of the gifts it grants. In the practice process, there is a permission, and there is a premise, and there is a promise. The permission, if we're practicing, while we're doing our projects and within our plans and on purpose, it gives us permission to be clumsy and inept and inadequate and sometimes inappropriate. You see, once we lose that, we stop trying, we stop experimenting, and we stop wondering. We stop living.
Well, I found in my life that I have to be willing to be bad at something before I can ever be good at it.
Wonderful. And acknowledge that anything we do well, we started pretty bad.
Yes.
Which flies in the face of the Kurt Uiop we've talked about, that if something is worth doing, it's worth doing well. And if you don't do it well, you don't do it. That's bad counsel. Bad counsel. Yes, start practicing. Give yourself permission to be inept and inadequate and clumsy. The premise, however, is that you do have to stretch. I mean, you have to go for the improbable. Call on the people who probably won't buy or sign up. Go after the ball you probably can't get. You understand what I'm saying? In other words, you've got to stretch. I don't say comfort zone exiting, but still you have to stretch. But the promise of it all, Gina, we all know is what? that you're gonna get better. There is no way that you cannot. And if that practice is influenced by purpose, there is no way to go but up. For example, in our society, we tend to talk in terms of success as elevation. Okay? Would it be easier to elevate when your leading edge is the apex of a purpose triangle or the broad, blunt edge of a
Fear,
posture?
huh?
Well, what would be the most difficult? There's no question. This is a major, major issue. To define that purpose is probably the first project that we have in order to goal set, or perhaps better still, to define our pursuits. We're beginning to wind down. I can't believe we've used up nearly a half hour already. I did want to say this, that if people would like to get a cassette tape of this show or write you a letter so that we could discuss it on the air, communicate with us in any way, perhaps they should be calling 800 number. It's 1-800-661-3490. Now, let me say that once again. It's 1-800-661-3490. I would certainly appreciate, and I know you would too, if people who are watching would call and say, hey, I saw the show, have a question, a comment, a critique, or a criticism, or a compliment. We'll take it all, you know, but to let us know that they're getting something out of this. And to be aware that next week, we're going to proceed into another dimension of this very same subject. So that we can get it clearer and clearer and clearer.
And I'm excited to go there, and I just wanted to say to the audience, I am taking notes here, and I'd be happy to send you a copy of my notes. There's been a lot of interest in the show and a lot of people who want to know more. I think the material is so exciting. We want to get as much of it out as we can.
I've been pleased the number of people who say they've seen us, and yeah, I think this is going fine. I'll tell you what, I think it's time to say thank you to everyone for taking the time and giving us the courtesy of listening and watching. So I want to write my thank you note, and I think it's okay to sign off and remember that this is Bern
Moses.
Thank you, Gina.
Thank you, Bern.